This is a pawn. This is a pawn when it grows up to a queen. Okay, so this is take 3. This is my 3rd time attempting this video. The first time I messed up at a crucial point, and then the second time I literally didn't even press the record button. So I sat there. I sat there and talked for like 4 minutes and was like, yeah, I looked at the thing and I'm like, wait a minute, why does it say 0? Ah, boy. Okay, let me see if I can get this one correct. For all of my people in the Philippines, mabuhay, kumusta na? Masaya kong makita kang muli. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Almusal tayo, mag-lunch na tayo. Ingat lagi. Mabuting pagbati. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Aking mga kaibigan. So for anybody who is coming from Norway, I will say God Morgan and Tusen Tak. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by real quick. But if you guys are ready to go, like I'm really ready to get this video done, let's roll. All right, so we got E4, E5, knight to F3. We see knight to C6. We got bishop to C4, bishop to C5, C3, knight to F6, and then we have D4. So we have the Giuoco piano, and it is the center attack. So, you know, it's a little bit different, you know, than the Giuoco pianissimo because it's a little bit, you know, it's considered a little bit more quiet, a little slower play. This is a little bit more aggressive. And we are going to see a whole lot of Zwishes moves, a little in-betweeners. So we do see pawn takes D4 and not the general take back on D4. We see E5. And then we see another move, another in-between move with D5. We see bishop to B5, knight to E4. We see pawn takes D4, bishop to B6, and then we see knight to C3. So as you guys can see, you know, we had a little bit of little in-betweeners going on in the middle. So we see castles by black. We see bishop to E3. Bishop comes to G4. And then we do see H3. And so you guys can see, like, you know, white and black are both, you know, pretty much just developing their pieces, getting them onto legitimate squares. You know, black only just needs to get their queen into play. And, you know, white just needs to get castled somewhere. So we do see bishop to H5. We see queen to C2. So now we have a lot of pressure on this, you know, this knight on E4. So we see knight takes C3 and then pawn takes C3. Now, some of you guys might be wondering, like, why can't you take with the queen? Well, the unfortunate situation that you see yourself in here is if you take with your queen, you're going to be really, really sad after bishop to A5. And that's a big oops. This is a really, really nasty pin to be under. And it's kind of hard. I think it's a little bit harder to see than normal because usually the bishop is kind of back here on F8. So you're visualizing it developing to bishop to B4, and it doesn't really seem as much like it's going to do it on B6. But be careful with that. Do not get under this situation. So like I said, we do see pawn takes C3. And this just gives white a really, really nice pawn center. So black is, you know, having to do something about that. So we see F6. Now, for those of you that play the French defense, this position should look very familiar to you. You know, because this is definitely something that you do whenever you're trying to break down white's structure is by playing F6. It's one of the most like common pawn breaks. C5 and F6 are the most common pawn breaks for French defense players or even Carol-Con players too. So we see pawn takes F6, queen takes F6, and then we see bishop back to E2 because we do have a lot of heat on this knight here. So we want to get that taken care of. So we do see knight to A5. You know, it's pretty clear that this knight wants to hop into C4. You know, give the knight a really nice little outpost. So we see castles by white. See bishop takes F3, bishop takes F3. We see C6, just giving the bishop a little bit of room to breathe and back up. So we see rook A to E1, and then we have knight to C4. And you know, the position is pretty open. So we don't want this knight to be able to trade itself off for this bishop. You know, we want to preserve the bishop pair in this type of position. Now, if it's like locked up, you had a bunch of pawns in the center, and it's like, you know, you kind of need to maneuver, then it probably wouldn't be that bad of a deal to allow the knight to give itself up for a bishop because, you know, it's just going to be beneficial for you. So we do see bishop down to C1, and this is the most logical retreat for it. Mostly because that's really the only square it can go to legitimately because, you know, it was just going to get traded if it went to D2. But it's pretty instructive because, you know, the bishop is now dominating this knight in its position. So you see this knight doesn't really have anywhere to go to in white's position. So that visually should, you know, be a little something for you because, you know, it presents itself, differently in different positions of the game. So we do see queen to g6. We see queen taking g6. Pawn taking g6. We see rook up to e7, which seems like it's doing a lot of damage. But you do have rook to f7. So it just kind of blunts everything that, you know, white is trying to do with this rook on the 7th. So we do retreat back to e2. We see bishop to a5, and then we actually see rook to c2 in the game, which just defends the pawn. And we don't have to worry about the knight coming here and kicking the rook. Like I said, this bishop is holding it. Plus, you know, this pawn is doing it too. So, but a really nice like little in-between move that we could do is actually bishop to g4. And this is like a little sneaky move because we're looking at trying to maybe get to this square and pin this rook down to this king. So the king has to be smart. So, you know, it probably would sidestep to fa, and then you can go king. You can go rook to c2. So, you know, just whenever you produce a threat, you know, sometimes your opponent has to respond to the threat. So that's just, you know, how that goes. Like I said, we do see rook to c2. We see rook over to e8. Logical. You're taking over that file. We see bishop down to e2. Rook f to e7. So we're getting, you know, a little bit of heavy pressure on this e file. So the bishop comes to d3. We see king down to f7. We see g3. You know, just allowing like the utmost luft for our king. You know, so our king has options. Go here, go here. We see b5, pretty solidifying that knight in the center of the board. We see h4, rook down to e1. We see king to g2, bishop back to c7. We see a4, you know, trying to, you know, that's really your only pawn breaking the position. You're trying to break down, you know, what black has going on here. But we do see a5. Bishop comes to g5. We see rook takes f1, king takes f1, pawn takes a4, bishop takes c4, pawn takes c4, and then we see rook to a2. And we're going to be getting our pawn back. There's no way to hold on to this pawn at all. So we see king to e6. We see rook takes a4. We see king down to d5. Because there was also not another way to defend that pawn other than the king. So the king has to step over there. So we see rook to a2. And we have rook to a8. So this is actually a very beneficial position for black. Because you do have this outside pass pawn. So you're going to be getting into a pretty defensive position as white coming up. So we do see bishop to e7, just trying to add extra support to make sure that this pawn doesn't push farther than necessary. So we do see a4. Bishop comes down to b4, but we immediately have bishop to d6. And this is just completely challenging the bishop, and now it's forcing a trade. So we see bishop takes d6, king takes d6. We see king to e2, c5, king comes to e3. Because we would really like to, after the trade, take back with the king. And our king would be like in a really, you know, a lot more dominant position than they're in right now. So we see a3, not taking yet as black. We see g4. We see king down to d5. We see pawn takes c5, king takes c5, and then we see rook down to a1. We see king over to b5. We see rook to b1. We see rook to a4. We see rook to b4 with check because we're trying to back this king up some. We see king to a5, rook back down to b1. We see king to a4, rook back to b4 with check, king to a5, rook back down to b1, and then we have king to a4. And it is actually in this position that the players do agree to a draw. Now, I don't think I mentioned it. Let me go back here. After bishop came down to c1, queen to g6 was the novelty of the game. So I'm like super late, but that was the novelty of the game. I had some notes like close together, so I missed that. But we have come to the point in the game that if you do want to actually stop the video, let's see. After rook to b4, we see rook to a5, rook back down to b1. There's actually a win in the position for black. So if you do want to stop the video and see if you can spot this win for black, go ahead and do so. All right, cool. So, it's probably not the easiest move to find because you're thinking like, man, you want to really just try to like push this pawn forward. But this thing about the situation is this king can actually hold this pawn on its own, and you're pretty free to move your rook. So you guys see that this file is completely taken by this rook. So the most logical place for the rook to move is actually to d8. So if you found rook to d8, congratulations, you did find the best move in the position. It is, like I said, it is a win. it is cutting this king off from trying to come further this way on the board. And so, you know, we would possibly see something like, you know, king to f4, and then rook would come down to d2. King would come up to g5. We would see a2 attacking the rook on b1. We'd see rook over to e1, king to a4, king takes g6, king to b3. You know, you are getting into a position right now where the rook is going to have to give itself up for this pawn. So once this king gets down to b1 or to b2, you're going to be able to, you know, push this pawn forward. And these pawns are just a little bit too slow. You know, this rook I mean, the king is going to be able to come back up and get this pawn. You're going to have another pass pawn. You also are going to have an entire rook. So you're doing pretty good. Some of you guys after rook to d8 might be thinking, well, like, why would I move the king away? Like, why don't I just try to do, you know, something else? So, like, let's say, for example, you try to just push h5. This actually is not going to work because pawn is going to take h5, pawn is going to take h5, and then you actually have a rook to d3 with check. And so not only are you cut off on that file, you're also getting checked, so you're going to have to move somewhere else. So the king will possibly come up to e4. You would throw in a little in-betweener a2. The rook would come over to a1. You have rook to d2. King down to e3 trying to attack, but rook to c2. And as you guys can see, there is no way to make progress in this direction. And this pawn is going to be falling pretty soon. And this king is still going to pretty much do the same thing as it was doing before. It just kind of creep itself down into this position. So this was another chance. This was another situation where, you know, Magnus Carlsen actually had a win. And he went ahead and just went for a draw. Like I said, you know, Magnus Carlsen, by this point, he only needed draws. You know, especially when he's playing black. I mean, you know, usually, like, draws are wins for black pretty much. So that's pretty much how they get calculated in these different tournaments and stuff. So that was all he needed right there. So that was that game. So for all my people in the Philippines, I got a phrase that I'm going to attempt to say, but I also have the good mornings. So maanyong buntag, mayad na agahan, nainbag na bigat, masento siya kawasan, marhe na aga, buenas dias, maanyong aga, mapian na uma, kapian kapano dios, mayap a abak. I think, did I forget one? Mayapa abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abukla, marja na buntag, marya my nat, malpe na aga, kasanyangan si elubi, salam, assalamu alaikum, merci. And the phrase that I was trying to say is I'll see you later. So kita na long tayo mamaya. I kind of have a little bit of it, but I don't have the whole thing, so I cheated a little bit. But I will get it coming up. That's the phrase I'm working on. I'll see you later. And I appreciate it very much, and I'll see you guys next time.